Hello and welcome to the Psych 150 Sexism and Racism Depth Assignment. First, let's start off by looking at this photograph. What's going on in it? Who is in this picture? What's their relationship to each other? Some of that may have to do with when the picture was taken. What are your thoughts, especially if you look at the key central figures in the picture? Well, it turns out this photograph has some years behind it. It dates back to 1969. At that time, the mayor of New York City, John Lindsay, who is the man depicted in the doorway, he was meeting with the internationally famous gospel singer Mahalia Jackson. She had a concert at Harlem Park, and she was there in her motor home that she used to travel the country like musicians have done for decades and will for decades more, no doubt. And she was there, and he needed help because he was not doing real well in his re-election attempt. And so he went to her. He went to her to ask for help. So that's the facts of the situation. Oh, and one more thing. This photograph was not actually used in the New York Times in 1969. It was not run because the photograph depicted Ms. Jackson with her arm over the mayor's shoulder, Mr. Lindsay's shoulder, in a real familiar kind of pose. And there was concerns that it would look unseemly to the public at that time. This was part of a series recently run by the New York Times on their website, taking photographs from many, many years back and presenting them to see what people remembered about the people in the picture, the events, what's going on, who are the folks. And this is what they said about this photograph and their summary of the responses they got in the comments section. And many of the responses, and this is quite telling in terms of race, gender, and perception, the people who wrote in assumed that the woman, Ms. Jackson, was either grateful or submissive to the man, Mayor Lindsay. But that's actually opposite of what was going on. Mayor Lindsay was the supplicant. He needed Mahalia Jackson's help. She could speak well of him and influence the opinion of thousands that were relevant for that election. He needed her help and went to ask for it. So wrapped up in this photograph is a lot of issues of racism, sexism, and how we think about people and assumptions we make when we're out of facts. To talk about these issues, we have to make sure we're on the same ground in terms of the terms we're using. Sometimes these concepts get a little bit confused. A stereotype is a belief about a whole group or people that have certain traits that we assume they have. These are our cognitions, our thoughts. Prejudices are feelings, judgments, attitudes about individuals because they're connected to a social group, an affect or feeling about them. And discrimination is the behaviors, usually negative, directed against persons because of their membership in a particular group, treating them differently because of it. Now, these things interact with each other. Discrimination influences stereotypes. Stereotypes influence the likelihood of engaging in discriminatory behavior. Stereotypes influence prejudice. Prejudice influences stereotypes. If you have a negative attitude, you're more likely to store new information that confirms the attitude. In prejudice, negative attitudes are more likely to lead to discriminatory behavior, and discriminatory behavior is more likely to lead to attitudes that are even more consistent with it. And so they interact and reinforce each other, making for a very, very difficult problem to solve in terms of everyday living. Other important terms to make sure we understand is the differences between racism and sexism that we'll dig into even more. Racism is prejudice and discrimination based upon a person's racial background, and sexism is prejudice and discrimination based upon a person's gender. In both of these cases, in cases of other isms, there's both individual and institutional and cultural versions that can exist. That is the person-to-person interaction, but also the creation of systems that reinforce or cause problems for certain persons because of their membership in groups that are disadvantaged. Racism and sexism are the most widely studied of these. When we look at this photograph, we're capturing another moment. It's kind of similar to the Mayor Lindsay Mahalia Jackson situation. We have Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton running for president, running for the Democratic nomination in 2008. And attacks against Hillary Clinton, no matter where they were from, but that included from the Obama camp, were treated as sexism. They were called sexism. And attacks on Obama, wherever they came from, some of them were from the Hillary Clinton camp, attacks on Barack Obama were treated as racism. That's the things that were said. So it was kind of a real hot kettle of these things going on, of us studying it, understanding and seeing it in action. But there's other isms out there. There's ageism, stereotypes and beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors against people or about people because of their age. You're too young to be doing such things. You're too old to be able to do such things. There's singleism. I'm sure some of y'all experience that. When are you going to get married? What do you mean you're not dating anybody? That's singleism at work. We assume that you are supposed to be in a relationship if you're going to be a complete person. Think about that. You're a person, but you're not complete without someone else? That seems kind of odd, doesn't it? But that is how we tend to act. And sexual orientation. Treating people as less than or worse than because of whom they express and feel love for. Fat shaming. An ism about weight. Persons that are overweight treated as somehow not having self-control, having poor attitudes about themselves, and so forth. And there's childlessism. You may have never heard this one, unless you're married. As soon as you're married, the first question is when you're going to have babies. Here's the other one, though, only childism. As soon as you had a baby, the next question is when you're going to have another one. Really? If you were without children, if you decide you don't want to be married, singleism is happening to you. If you're married but you decide you don't want to have children, then people will treat you as somehow imperfect or less than. If you have a single child and don't have more than one child, people will treat you as if you're some kind of awful person for not having a second child. We're going to focus on racism and sexism in this presentation because those are the ones most commonly studied. It's where most of the rich research is. And it also enables us to talk about a critical distinction that happens in a variety of isms. Racism is prejudice and discrimination based upon a person's racial background. And racism exists at all kinds of levels. The individual level of an individual person's treatment or thoughts about towards another person. It can also occur at the institutional level. Some persons are privileged while others are discriminated against. Usually it's because the privileged persons created the institutions that operate, govern, manage the cultural situation, and therefore many of the assumptions and opportunities are kind of built to facilitate the outcomes of one group at the disadvantage of another. Privilege. It's an interesting word, and a lot of people react negatively to it. But it's an important word to make sure we understand what we're talking about. We're not talking about some extra benefit. We're not talking about some kind of special, wonderful treatment. That when you're born a white child, that suddenly $1 million appears in your bank account or something of that nature. Though in a certain metaphorical sense, that is what's happened. Privilege is really about not having to suffer things that a lot of other people do have to suffer. As a white person, when I walk into a grocery store, nobody turns their head to wonder if I'm going to be someone who causes them a problem. Yet if you were to ask many of your African American student friends, or maybe you're an African American student yourself, you've experienced this, you would discover that the mere act of walking into a store is to catch a look that doesn't mask a look of concern. That opportunity to just be you in that space is cut short right there. A white person is clueless as this. That's why when a white person hears the idea of being privileged, they really don't understand what's meant by it. They don't get that the privilege is to not be subjected to not have to suffer the indignity of. So keep that in the back of your mind as we talk about some of these things. When we talk about racism, there's a variety of different kinds. There's old-fashioned racism, as we might say, and it makes it sound kind of like, gosh, back in the good old days, like it's some kind of kindly, okay way of being. But that's not what we mean by that. Old-fashioned is kind of the racism that is overt, out in the open, physical, damaging. We'd like to think a lot of that's gone. But I tell you what, this last presidential election season sure did show some pretty nasty stuff, didn't it? So it may not be clearly that way. And we know that a lot of our institutions engage in a good deal of very overt, very damaging kinds of racism of the old-fashioned type. More often now, though, we see what we refer to sometimes as modern or subtle racism, implicit racism. There's a subtle form of prejudice that surfaces sometimes in direct ways when the persons think it's safe to do so, when it's socially acceptable, when it's easy to rationalize, when you can blame it on something else. Well, I'm not being racist, it's just this fact is true. That kind of thing. And it's based upon the idea that many people are racially ambivalent. They have positive feelings and negative feelings, and they're kind of at battle. And it can lead to unconscious forms of prejudice and discrimination. Now, y'all should have taken an implicit associations test by this point, so you have an awareness of maybe some of this kind of thinking applying to you already. One really interesting study on modern racism is a study of umpires in Major League Baseball. And what they did was they looked at archives, and they were looking at when on balls and strikes being called for pitchers. And Major League umpires called more strikes for pitchers who were of their same race. That is, white umpire, white pitcher, black umpire, black pitcher, when the following things were true. There was no close monitoring. Usually that means basically it's on TV, so there's like tape that can be reviewed. They're looking at box scores in newspapers and other records like that, and then they can look up the individuals, the pitcher who was on the mound and the umpire, to get racial demographic information about them because it's in the historical record. When there's low attendance at the game, which is kind of similar to no close monitoring, not many people there, not many people to witness what's going on, and it's not the final ball or strike, that is, it's not going to have big consequences for the outcome. And so it gets the batter to being close to out quicker, but it won't necessarily call them out quicker if they're already at the second strike. And we're just talking about implicit racism, but it's that unconscious and automatic cognitive processing that's showing an underlying racial bias in how we process ambiguous information. And it's gained a lot of prominence in recent years in the context of police shooting of unarmed black persons. It's not so much that an officer may express overt racism, but in the moment where he or she has to make a quick decision, these implicit biases are probably all that's operating, and they are making a snap decision based upon information that is biased by processes that are virtually impossible to literally control. As y'all noticed, you measure it using the implicit associations test. There is some discussions about the validity of the IAT. There's discussions about the validity of everything. It seems to be working pretty well. This kind of thing kind of shows up in a variety of ways. I'm going to show you an image here. And what you're looking at is a series of black faces and white faces in terms of coloring, and a little bit in terms of stereotyped hairstyles. And then you've got facial features. And here's the thing. The facial features from the eyebrows down to the neck are identical in the two pictures. The only difference is color of skin shading and the hair that's above that. And what was found is the images of the African American appearing face. These are cartoon faces. Let's face it, these aren't exactly realistic depictions of a face. Tended to be associated with a greater degree of perception of aggression or anger for the black faces than the white faces, but only for persons who had high implicit bias. That is, the higher a person's implicit bias was, they would tend to see a greater degree of anger in the black faces. Now imagine this playing out in the milliseconds of time that a police officer might have to think. Now this isn't meant to be an excuse, don't get me wrong. It's meant to help us clarify an understanding of what processes and difficulties might be underway. So sexism. Sexism are prejudices and discrimination based upon a person's gender. Sexism and racism are different from each other. Virtually all group stereotypes are descriptive. That is, beliefs about the nature of the members of the group. When we're talking about racial group stereotypes, we tend to talk about things that describe the group's ways of being, ways of thinking, ways of behaving. But gender stereotypes are different. They tend to be prescriptive. That is to say, they tend to indicate what a woman or a man should do rather than description of what's believed about them. Now, just to be clear, there are definitely some stereotypical bits of information about men and women that are descriptive. And there are definitely racially based stereotypes that are prescriptive in their nature. But in terms of the vast amount of stereotypical information that one might want to examine related to race, it tends to be descriptive and less so prescriptive. When we're talking about gender, it tends to be prescriptive rather than descriptive. That is, women should not be working outside the home. Women should not be engaging in voting once upon a time. Men should not be the primary caregiver for children. And in fact, even things that say what people should be. When my mother applied for law school in 1971, she was told by the dean of the law school at LSU, Louisiana State University, quote, "Madam, in my opinion, the law is no place for a woman." That's very much a prescriptive statement, isn't it? You don't belong. You should not do this. My mother did go on to win her class's moot court competition, which is where you demonstrate proficiency and skill in the courtroom. She was pretty good. She also went on to argue a case before the United States Supreme Court. She was very good. I guess the law was a place for women. And increasingly so now. Approximately 50% of most law school classes are women nowadays. Ambivalent sexism consists of two elements. Hostile sexism, characterized by negative and resentful feelings about women, values the ability to challenge men's power. And of course, the next point clarifies what we mean by ambivalent, which is having two sides, a positive and a negative. There's also benevolent sexism, characterized by affectionate, chivalrous, but often patronizing feeling. Women need and deserve protection, the putting a woman on a pedestal kind of thinking. That's the hard one to tell someone is bad. God, I'm thinking good things about women. Yeah. And by putting them on a pedestal, you make it harder for them to just go ahead and do their job, do their life, and be themselves. You're restricting them to the pedestal. There's also double standards involved here. The concept of the double standard is that women are held to a different standard than men. For instance, in evaluating job candidates, some persons that were being evaluated were described as agentic. Agentic means the person makes decisions for themselves, causes outcomes, is assertive, and seeks out the opportunity to cause things to happen. Communal is kind of the opposite. It's about bringing together, forming group, generating consensus, and leading within rather than in front. Now, women who were described as agentic were then later described as being not socially skilled by persons who read these job candidates. They were described in the candidate information as agentic. They were described later as not socially skilled. But that kind of negative note was not made about men who were represented as agentic. So the same exact behaviors, all they did was change the name and gender stuff. They probably didn't even change the name because there's plenty of gender neutral names out there. You don't see the same thing. Men who are agentic are, well, they're fine. Women who are agentic are not socially skilled. Wow. That's a lot to carry, isn't it? The last major topic I want to talk about is called stereotype threat. How do the targets of stereotypes and prejudice deal with it? What's the effect on them? Well, there's lots of effects. I'm going to have you do a secondary exercise on this as well. Stereotype threat is the fear that one will be reduced to a stereotype in the eyes of others. That your behavior, that what you do, how you act, that others are going to see it and say, yeah, there they are, confirming the stereotype, acting like, a woman acts, acting like, an African American acts. That kind of statement, that kind of thinking. Worry that you're going to cause others to think that. So women regarding math, they sit down to do a math test. And they're worried that by doing bad on the math test, they'll be confirming the notion that women aren't good at math. Or African Americans and academics often are concerned that by doing badly, they're going to reinforce a notion that is widely held as a stereotype. Student athletes and academics often are concerned about perpetuating the stereotype that student athletes are dumb jocks. And overweight persons being reminded of weight issues, being concerned standing in line at the buffet looks bad. Eating alone looks like, they can't even wait to be with their friends to eat. They've got to eat some more right now. I'll bet they're going back for a second helping at the buffet line, and so forth. They're worried that other people are going to think those things. And that worry affects their behavior. I'm going to focus on academic achievement. How can it affect it? What we know is that they can directly interfere with the performance by inhibiting cognitive capacity. For instance, when a woman sits down to take a math exam, if the first thing she's asked on the front page is to indicate her gender, she will tend to do worse on that exam than if she's not indicated her gender, if it's indicated at the end of the exam. Being reminded of her female status at the start of the exam appears to damage her ability to do well on the exam later. Well, why would that be the case? And the reason appears to be is that they're worried about reinforcing the stereotype. They're worried about doing bad. It becomes the main concern. Instead of focusing on doing well and focusing on the problems, they're worried about doing bad. Now you remember when you were studying the brain and studying learning and memory that we learned something about that there's a tendency for us to only be able to juggle about 7 ideas in our mind at any given one time. And if several of those spaces are filled with worry about reinforcing a stereotype, well, you're kind of operating with part of your brain tied behind your back. You're not as effective in working on the problems because you don't have as much of your brain available to you. This would apply to many of these kinds of academic achievement stereotypes. The worry that you may reinforce it actually leads you to reinforce it. It's horrible. It can do another thing too. It can cause an individual to just dismiss the domain as no longer relevant, and therefore they stop trying. A person who is put into a situation where they are made to believe they're likely to fail because of stereotypes, where they don't want to try to reinforce the stereotype, they simply go, I'm just not going to worry about it anymore. Not my thing. It doesn't have anything to do with my feelings about myself, my identity. I'm not going to try. I now have an excuse for doing bad that's about me not trying. It has nothing to do with the actual outcomes. Other people can think what they want. Either way, the performance is degraded. How can we fix this? Now, I'm going to have you read a lot more about this, but I was able to sit in on a presentation by Dr. Claude Steele at the Eastern Psychological Association convention a few years ago in New York City. And he presented some information about black students at Yale, where he was working, and found that if new incoming black students at Yale were presented information from former black students about the difficulties and opportunities that they found in fitting in and adjusting and getting used to the college environment at Yale, that it was helpful. That is to say, by hearing from these students that you're going to face some unique difficulties, but you also have some unique opportunities. And this is how I found a way to fit in, and you might find you can find some similar ways to fit in. And these are where I found some difficulties, but this is how I found some ways to overcome them. That just hearing that makes a student feel less lost and concerned, and a little bit more focused on, well, then it's okay, I'm fine here. I'm not reminded that I'm different. I'm reminded that I can fit in too. And simply doing this intervention appears to have caused a 1/3 grade point average improvement in the following semester, plus an additional third point the next semester. Now, what does that mean, a third grade point? Well, a student that maybe would have made a 2.7 GPA ends up going up to about a 3.0, and then the following semester something like a 3.3. That's huge. The difference between how you think about yourself with a 2.7 versus a 3.3 that's pretty big, isn't it? I'm going to have you now go to a web page after you're finished with this and look at some more interventions that are understood to be helpful for reducing stereotype threat. Thanks for your attention to this, and I'll have more later. Bye.